Thank you so much for that fascinating and interesting toast. So now it's a great pleasure to welcome and introduce our distinguished guest this evening, Dr. Donald Smith. Donald is a graduate in English and Ancient Greek from the University of Edinburgh, and his PhD was awarded by the School of Scottish Studies here. Donald is a poet, a playwright, a novelist, theatre and cultural director, as well as being a storyteller. He's a founding director of the National Theatre of Scotland. He is perhaps best known, though, as the founding director of the Scottish Storytelling Centre, which is based in the 15th century building here in Edinburgh, known as John Knox's house. In that role, Donald planned the first ever Scottish International Storytelling Festival in 1988, which was an important step in the preservation and enjoyment of Scottish traditional arts and oral narratives. The festival has gone on to become an annual event, of course, with Donald continuing to be involved in it right up until his retirement at the end of last year. Donald also expanded the Scottish Storytelling Centre so as to include the world's first purpose-built centre for live storytelling. Donald's a prolific writer, and he has kindly brought along some copies of the book that he wrote for Edinburgh 900, available for sale later this evening. Now, Donald has spoken to club members on a previous occasion, and many of you will have attended the wonderful lecture that he gave back in September 2019, entitled Scott, Our Convivial Host. And so I now invite Donald to give the reply. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these kind words and the toast. President, friends, this won't be a lecture. It's just some remarks that will help round off the evening, I hope. I have to be absolutely honest and say, when I see that word, reply to a toast, a certain fear creeps over me. And I have to say, this has all been very civilised tonight. Yes, but I have almost nightmarish memories of somehow agreeing to take part in an alternative burn supper at the old Traverse Theatre, where I was expected to reply to a toast to the laddies, which was being given by a very fiery and recently divorced Leslie Riddoch. And having to come up with something on the spur of the moment. And I'm sure some here, David, I think David Purvis, is David here? No? Yeah. But we also have experienced the Tarbolton Bachelors Club, the oldest Burns club. And again in my innocence, I agreed to reply to somebody's toast. I was aghast to arrive there to find that the programme was stacked with a toast, a reply to the toast, a reply to the reply to the toast, which looked like it was going to extend into an early morning epic. Okay, so we're not in that situation, and I want to just pick up, and it picks up on several things that have been said by our previous excellent contributors tonight about Scott's ability to be a cooperative force, an encourager, a collaborator, a networker. And what I found when asked to write about literature in Edinburgh over the 9 centuries, the city's much older than 9 centuries, of course, but we're just talking about the official borough charter, as it were, sort of celebrating bureaucracy. But to look at the storytellers and writers who shaped our perceptions of the city through the generations, and gave a sense of the city's interconnectedness through its literature and its religion and its philosophy and its art and architecture with other parts of Scotland and throughout the world. And it made me realise how much literature is a conversation between writers, both living and across the centuries, a conversation between writers and readers, because it's the perceptions and choices of readers that ensure what is going to last, what will go on being read, what will go on having an influence. And so thinking about that, about this wider sense of a conversation through time, I just want to illustrate a few of the ways in which Scott plays a really important role beyond his personal talent through his capacity to engage and connect. So let's take an example first about Scott and the chroniclers of Scotland. And Scott, of course, as David was referring there, one of his great pieces of storytelling is Tales of a Grandchild. And that is his version of Scotland's overall story. And in doing that, Scott was responding to the earlier medieval chroniclers, and in particular to Abbot Bowyer, Walter Bowyer, who is the author and compiler of the magnificent Scotichronicon, and he was the abbot over there in Inchcolm on the Forth, where he had access to the libraries of Dunfermline and of St Andrews. And he himself, Bowyer, undertook this work as a conscious collaborative venture, trying to complete and carry forward what earlier chroniclers such as John of Fordoun had achieved. And the point of this was that many of the official documents of Scotland had been lost in the course of the wars of resistance. They were shipwrecked and whatever. There was a big gap. And people set about trying to fill it, to provide a connected narrative. Now, Bowyer finishes his work, he lays down his pen with a wonderful Latin poem, which we'll have in translation. Be silent, breeze, my ship has reached the shore. Gladly I abandon the seas and come to a halt, praise and glory to Christ. Here this work comes to an end, and the author ceases to write the book which he is accustomed to call the Scotichronicon. This book covers the acts and awesome deeds of kings, bishops, and likewise of the leading men of the people. Fordoun has produced 5 books, and the author 11, which it will be clear to you makes 16 in all. I think he was a bit of a school teacher as well. So, reader, in return for their prayers, we ask you to pray that both authors may be dwellers in the realm of the sky. Christ, he is not a Scot who is not pleased with this book. Which I think is a pretty tremendous finish. But what you have to recognise is that Scott, in his taking up the mantle of narrating the nation, quite consciously picks up from these older chroniclers and storytellers and historians. And what you get in Bowyer, even those who have never read him, are hugely influenced by him, because he it is that puts together the rise of the Canmore dynasty, which he sees as central to Scotland's identity as a medieval Christian nation. And then Bowyer picks up the great struggle of resistance against conquest, where he leans on the epic poets as well as the chroniclers and historians. And his narratives have shaped popular perception for centuries. And equally, Scott has the same kind of influence. So he carries the story forward. He defines the tragic drama of Mary, Queen of Scots. He defines the popular perception of the Jacobite risings as bound to fail, yet heroic, you know. So there's just a connection in all that. And, you know, Tales of a Grandchild, Scott looking to how that story would be carried forward and continue to evolve and change. So that's just one example of Scott as being somebody who is collaborating, cooperating, drawing in material, listening, engaging, in some cases, with writers who are not with us and haven't been with us for centuries. He's got that kind of range, and he carries it forward. So another quick example is really, which this Peter has touched on, that Scott himself was in the centre of a literary circle. And Lockhart has been mentioned, his own son-in-law, very important to that. There was Leyden, and of course there was Blackwood's magazine and all the contributors and writers, and there was, of course, James Hogg. And the Hogg relationship is fascinating because there's a tension there. And here are two people who have a very high opinion generally of each other and of each other's gifts, who support each other, yet they're coming from completely different social backgrounds and in some cases of belief. And the clash that Hogg quite memorably and I think humorously records is the clash that arises when Hogg has written The Brownie of Bodsbeck, which is a sympathetic novel to the Covenanters, and Scott has produced Old Mortality, basically depicting the Covenanters as fanatics. Although he doesn't himself use that word, but David Hume does. And this, of course, was because Hogg published this, getting in ahead of Lockhart's official life, which absolutely infuriated Lockhart. But Hogg, he couldn't contain himself, really. He felt he was sitting on this first-hand experience, and he was. And now this happens just within a couple of 100 yards of where we're sitting at the moment. Hogg is in the habit, this is not a one-off, of going to visit Scott at breakfast time. And, you know, having something to eat and having a good chat about the day before they depart to whatever they're going to do. There was once more, and only once, that I found Sir Walter in the same querulous humour with me. It was the day after the publication of my Brownie of Bodsbeck. I called on him after his return from the Parliament House, so this one was later in the day, on pretence of asking his advice about some very important affair, but in fact to hear his sentiments of my new work. His shaggy eyebrows were hanging very low down, a bad prelude which I knew too well. I have read through your new work, Mr. Hogg, said he, and must tell you downright and plainly, as I always do, that I like it very ill indeed. What for, Mr. Scott? Because it is a false and unfair picture of the times and the existing characters, altogether an exaggerated and unfair picture. You know, minus. I dinna ken, Mr. Scott. It's the picture I've been bred up in the belief o' sin ere I was born, and I had it frae them whom I was most bound to honour and believe, and mair nor that. There's not one single incident in the tale, not one, which I cannot prove from history to be literally and positively true. And that's a great deal more than you can say for your tale of all mortality. You know, he could get as good as he got. Of course, this is his version, you know. It's like John Knox's version of Mary Queen of Scots said to him. Well. As to running counter to old mortality, says Scott, I've nothing to say, nothing in the world. I only tell you that with the exception of old Nanny, this crop-eared Covenanter, who is by far the best character you ever drew in your life, I dislike the tale exceedingly, and assure you it is a distorted, a prejudiced, and untrue picture of the royal party. Now, that is splendid. And, you know, underlying that, so the two quick observations about that, is a friendship, a relationship. It's important to each, how they write, what their, you know, emphasis is. Scott cares about it. He'd obviously read the book, you know, immediately on coming out. And the other thing, I would say to you that, of course, what we're seeing there in the 19th century is the different social and religious and political conflicts that are agitating 19th century Scotland, are being reflected in these tales about the conflicts of the 17th century. And you know, it's we thought, well, we've left all that behind us, you know, but I think there's something rather chillingly echoing there of contemporary ways of prejudice, of writing off an opposing view, of taking a fundamentalist position of things. We're kind of back in that world. And it's interesting that Scott, in his own way, is ahead of us. So, lastly, I just want, and this is touching on Scott and the theatre, which is another completely collaborative area, you know. So we know Scott had a kind of lonesome side. We get that in the journals. But he also had this incredible gregarious capacity to encourage and assist others, not least in the theatre, where he cooperated with adapters and producers and scene painters and actors and loved it all. Now, we're coming up, February 23rd, 1827, was the dinner at which Scott, for the first time, publicly and generally acknowledged that he was the author of Waverley. And this was a huge dinner in the assembly rooms, which was a theatre benefit in aid of Harriet Siddon, the great actor and theatre manager in Scottish theatre of the day. And they were all gathered to raise money in her support. She would be the daughter-in-law of the more famous Sarah Siddon, the greatest female performer of the age, the Queen of Tragedy, as she was called. And this event took place February 23rd, 1827, so it will be 200 years in February. And Scott had no intention of announcing this. It just came out. The chair of the gathering referred to it, and Scott didn't deny it. And this is where he was publicly outed as the author of Waverley. But what is interesting about this night, and incidentally there were endless toasts on this night, it got quite heavy going by the end, but there was a touching thing about it, because in fact it was 1 year to the day since Charlotte, his wife, had died, and he had been out of public life in mourning for this year. And then this was his first occasion that he appeared as an honoured guest at this theatre fundraising dinner, essentially. And so in relation to that night, a very interesting present-day writer, Helen Graham, as she has a novella coming out ahead of this bicentenary about that evening, about who was there, about, the different reactions to the different speeches. And of course, everybody who was anybody in Edinburgh, social, political, legal, literary life was there. It was like the creative industries in one room, and the literary boards and of course, the theatricals in big style. And Helen, who incidentally, she produced the very interesting fictional biography, The Real Mackay, of the Bailey, Charles Mackay, which is a good read. And this, I've had the chance to read her manuscript and comment on it. She has this very interesting idea. So there we were with this event, this great fundraiser for Harriet Siddons, and there was not a single woman in attendance. That, incidentally, was also true of the Tarbleton Bachelors Club. How they still got up with that, I have no idea. So there were no women, even Harriet Siddons, in attendance. So has this idea that Scott's mind begins to drift. And as he's sitting there, what his mind is turning to is, of course, his personal loss and grief that he's still marking, but to think of all the different women, creative women, with whom he has enjoyed creative friendships and cooperation. And it's a huge list. Joanna Baillie, as Scott regularly said, that it was her who had inspired him to get involved in theatre. She was poet and a dramatist, a busy correspondent of Scott, you know, so important. Scott obviously also had hugely positive things to say about Maria Edgeworth and her contribution from an Irish perspective to the national novel. He praised Susan Ferrier. And this was not a sort of casual commendation. He followed up with visits, with hospitality, with letters. He reviewed Jane Austen. He is a hugely constructive influence on the development of women as important authors, not just in Scotland, but far beyond. So I just hold that up as one of the many ways in which Scott is a connector, that he brings together these different aspects of creative life, and he makes a personal effort to actually seal these connections with meaningful creative support, with meaningful hospitality. And there's a huge generosity of spirit in it, a huge generosity of spirit. So I was very happy to come previously and speak about the conviviality of Scott and to think about his the collecting of the Borders minstrelsy, and over 200 people contributed to that. You know, that Scott was Scott to not go off and cook it up in his lonely only. And working on this 900 years of literature in Edinburgh, really beginning right back with the oral storytellers and the legends, you see this ongoing conversation and cooperation and collaboration that literature enables, and is probably the most important thing, not texts and books, but the human identity and the human solidarity and the human sympathy and understanding that comes out of that process. So I think as we think, thank you David and Peter for those interesting contributions, as we move forward in a city of culture, of theatre, of literature, of the creative industries, of digital, of film, of TV adaptation. Scott's right in there. He's ahead of us. He's ahead of us. A supreme connector and a generous, generous sympathiser and collaborator. So, we go on celebrating Scott. Thank you very much.
Well, Donald, thank you very much indeed for such an entertaining and enjoyable reply. Well, we're now approaching the end of our evening, and for the last vote on this election day, I invite long-standing club member Professor Margaret Bennett to give the vote of thanks.
Unless you can hear me from here. Can you? Shall I just go?
I think take advantage of the...
Madam Chair, Lords, ladies and gentlemen, I know you'll all agree with me that this has been another splendid Waterscott dinner and companionship. I've enjoyed every minute, and I know you have. The company, the speakers. Professor Peter Garside has given us a lot over the years. I'm looking forward to reading that new edition of Lockhart, by the way. I have to confess I like the other one too. Thank you very much for all. It's a tremendous contribution, and I know that we're all immensely grateful for that. And the Storytelling Centre. I think I was there at the very first meeting. Storytelling has been a big part in all of our lives, whether we're great readers or not. And I do think that fireside is where it all begins. For Scott it was. When he was 7, he could recite hours of poetry, and the dinner table in adulthood. His own description of sharing a dinner table with friends and the pleasure that brings. And more and more, I think we need this in this day of two thumbs on a device and the friends across speaking to you through a little screen. What a loss. So we're all doing well with our great appreciation for this. And Donald certainly has been a big part of our storytelling world. It's quite amazing when you see people coming in after a stressful day's work and then they go out light-hearted. And that great pleasure. And not just pleasure, it's a life-giving force. It's for our health, for our well-being, to share these times with each other. And I indeed would accord a great thanks to all, to Madeleine for keeping us all here, and to the staff for the arrangement of this, and to Lee. It's been it takes a lot to put this together, and we are all most grateful for all of your contributions. And so, as I bid you good night, and we to each other, thank you again to all of you for being here, for sharing this evening. Thank you.